That is to say that although there is a federal legislature, the Dewan Rakyat and Dewan Negara, but the states have their own state council. They retain the state councils which they had at the time when we were under British rule. But the state councils, of course, had limited power, especially with regard to taxation. They are allowed to tax activities that are based on the resources of the state. For the state would have control over the resources. If there is mining done in the state, then the revenue accrues to the state government. But the income tax, however, is levied by the federal government. So you can see that there is a sharing of the wealth or generated by the states between the states and the central government, the federation government. But mainly, of course, the states did not have much power in terms of raising funds for the state government. Because of this, the federal government decided that they should give some support to the state government financially. This is a very good idea because obviously some states are very poor, some states are very rich, and the income tax collected overall would be coming mainly from the richer states. Now, if the distribution of the central government funds is confined to the states which paid the taxes, then of course the poorer states would not be able to be administered well and to grow. So it was decided that the states should be given support by the government on the basis of per capita. If they have a certain number of people, then that will be taken into consideration for the purpose of subsidizing state governments. This, of course, was still not adequate, and frequently the federal government needs to give support in certain areas so as to enable the state to be well administered and to prosper. And at other times, the states were allowed to borrow from the federal government and also to borrow from other sources. But in order to do that, because eventually the federal government may have to pay the loans, then the federal government insists that any borrowing by the state must be with the approval of the central government. So you can see that there is a very good distribution of power, and this is made in such a way that even the poorer states benefit from the wealth coming from the richer states. Of course, when later on oil was discovered off Terengganu, Terengganu was one of the poorest states in Malaya, in Malaysia, in the peninsula. I remember when I first went to Terengganu before independence, the road from Kota Baru, I went to Kota Baru by air, but the road from Kota Baru to Kuala Terengganu was paved with loose stones, and there were 100 bridges, small wooden bridges. They were very, very bad indeed, so much so that when I asked a friend of mine, a doctor friend, who when he came to Kedah, borrowed my car, but when I went to Kota Baru and asked to borrow his car to go to Kuala Terengganu, he very rudely turned me down. It was only later, after I took a hired car to go to Kuala Terengganu, that I understood why he didn't want to lend his car to me. His car would be very much damaged by the kind of road that leads from Kota Baru to Kuala Terengganu. But now, of course, Terengganu is perhaps in terms of resource revenue, the richest state in Malaysia. It is even compared to the Kuwait of Malaysia. And they have so much money that they can afford to waste some of the money. Of course, this attracted the attention of some people who thought that if they can get at the Terengganu money, they can do a lot of things for themselves. But as you know, the ruler of Terengganu was wise enough to stop that acquisition of the Terengganu institution, which was supposed to help develop Terengganu. But today we see that Terengganu is very rich, and what is a little bit disappointing perhaps is that the rich states are not too keen to support the poor states. They are given 5% of the revenue, total revenue of the oil production. This is 5% of the total, not the 5% of the profit, but 5% of the total earnings of the petroleum company or Petronas. And that actually, in terms of revenue, is about 20% of the revenue. So they are getting 20% of the revenue after taxation and things like that. So I think, in the opinion of the poorer states like Kedah, that should be sufficient for them, because other states also wanted to have a share in the wealth generated by the production of oil offshore Terengganu. But we are a very gentle people. Actually, all the other poor states could gang up and invade Terengganu, overthrow the ruler perhaps, and take the oil revenue for themselves. But we are not like that. We are very civilized people. We sit around the table and discuss, not even heatedly, but discuss very rationally. And we, up to now, we have decided to keep the 5% revenue for Terengganu, Sarawak, and Sabah. The other states, unfortunately, seem not to have any oil. But I think Kelantan has got some oil, but because of political differences, we have not paid Kelantan their due, which is one of the reasons why they are very unhappy with the central government. But the fact remains that this federation has thrived despite the inequalities between the different states, the wealth of the different states. Selangor has prospered simply because Kuala Lumpur was chosen as the federal capital. Now, federal capital normally has all the facilities, and people like to gather here because they have to deal with the government, and the government is situated in Kuala Lumpur. So people tend to settle more in the federal capital than in the state capitals. So as a result, many people from the states have migrated to Kuala Lumpur, and over time they become Kuala Lumpur people and not belonging to their own state from where they came. Now, in order to facilitate administration again, it was felt that the capital city should be separately administered. This is, of course, a political decision, and as a result of that decision, Kuala Lumpur was made a federal territory administered by a nominated administrators. The government or the municipal municipality which has grown into the government of the city of Kuala Lumpur. Despite this, there was no objection on the part of the other states, although it has changed slightly the character of the federation. But of course, this was done with the consent of the rulers, because such changes of boundaries needs the assent of the rulers in. Then, of course, later on, the island of Labuan was made federal territory, and eventually Putrajaya itself was made a federal territory. All these things involve changes in borders, and changes in borders must have the consent of the rulers. And it is fortunate that the rulers of Selangor and Sabah were willing to have these areas declared as federal territory. So in a way, we can see that the federation worked very well in Malaysia. There is no demand for a unitary state. There is no attempt to secede from the federation. Indeed, seceding from the federation would be against the constitution of the country. No state may secede. All the time they must continue to be members of the federation. It shows that the federation government system of government works very well. Then, of course, as we have so many state councils and other than the federal council, there is a need for the governments, the elected governments, to be elected separately between the states and the federal legislature. So we have elections for the federal government, which is carried out throughout the country simultaneously at the same time. But the states can have their own elections, either together with the federal election or on their own. And we see in Sabah and Sarawak the state elections being held quite separately from the federal government. The federal government has shown no objection, nor do the other states show any objection. Now Johor is talking about having separate state elections. So we will have very many state councils, and they do form governments. In fact, we have more governments today than during the British period, when we had only 7 governments. Now we have 13 governments altogether, 14 together with the federal territories. Despite this multiplicity of governments, Malaysia has been able to present itself as a single country, that it has its own foreign policy, which is accepted by all the states, and it has, of course, a single federal consolidated fund, which is shared between the federal government and the state government. There are some areas where the state are quite independent, but not so independent as to be separate from the federal government completely. We have, as you know, we have some states being governed by different parties. Generally, one single party has ruled the country for the past, ever since independence, but some states are ruled by different parties. Despite that, there is fairly good cooperation between the center and the states. There is no absolute confrontation between the state government and the federal government. This enables Malaysia to be very stable. It is not a very good system that can enable stability to be sustained. But in Malaysia, the federal form of government work very well because security, finances, and also foreign policy remains completely with the central government. But beyond that, the central government has become extremely powerful because sometimes it exceeds the powers given to the central government in the federation. This is basically not because of the constitution of the state, but because the country somehow or other elected one single party to form the central government and to form the governments in most of the other states. The cooperation between the parties overcame the provisions of the constitution that the states are separate from the center. So we see almost as if the central government governs the state through perhaps their patronage over the state governments being of the same party, and also because of the control of the funds of government which would be used in order to support projects carried out in the states. One of the biggest projects earlier on was the Muda irrigation scheme, which at that time cost 400 million ringgit. No way can the state government of Kedah have this Muda irrigation scheme. But the Muda irrigation scheme, although it is meant to benefit the state of Kedah, was financed totally by the central government. And there is no obligation on the part of the state government to repay the money spent on the Muda irrigation scheme. Subsequently, there were other projects in Kelantan, in Selangor, in Sarawak, Sabah, where the federal government spent money on development projects, infrastructure, etc., yet the state gets all the benefit. There seemed to be no recrimination over this authority or the central government and the benefits accruing to the state governments. So in Malaysia, the federal system has worked very well. The state and the center cooperates mostly, although at times because of different political differences in politics, there seem to be some unfairness on the part of the federal government towards the state ruled by a different party. So if at all, I would say that the federal system in Malaysia works very well and should actually be a kind of model for other states wishing to share the power of government between the provinces and the center. Of course, most countries are divided into districts or provinces, and each may have their own head, like governors of provinces in Japan, but they are still basically unitary in terms of system of government. But whereas they are much more under the control of the central government, being a unitary state, but the federal state in Malaysia, the federation in Malaysia has worked quite well despite the sharing in terms of the wealth of the country and the local administration of the states. So that, I think, is something that Malaysia can congratulate itself, because it has made the federal system work despite having 9 sultans over each state plus one young deputy, federal head, young deputy Agung. Despite this tendency towards disunity, Malaysia has remained a well-administered federation, and it has been able to develop, despite the break-up into so many states. Malaysia has been able to develop well, much better perhaps than many unitary states which gained independence after the war. So I would say that the relationship between the federal and the state government in Malaysia is not completely without problems. There have been problems, but generally the problems were resolved, and there was no animosity or even antagonism between state and federal. Of course, the banking system as well as the monetary system is federal in nature. The states may not produce their own currency. They use the same currency, and this again contributes towards the good working relation between federal and state.